Sometimes the light is right, the composition is just the way you want it, and you think you have the money shot. But when you get home, the picture's blurry. If that ever happened to you and you wondered, why is my picture blurry? Today, we're going to talk about all the reasons that could make a picture come out blurry and why the autofocus didn't do what you wanted it to do. Hi, I'm Lynn Morton from ShutterBugLife.com. And if you ever came home thinking you had the money shot, but when you put the image on the big screen, you saw that it was blurry, today we'll talk about all the reasons that might have happened to you. And at the end of the video, I'll tell you why it happened to me. All right, let's get going. If you like what we're doing, of course, remember, hit the subscribe button, ring the bell. That makes sure that you get these updates whenever they come out. I remember a while back, I went through this phase where I'm shooting all these portraits, and so many of them, it seems like I'm missing the focus and the eyes are just a little too blurry. And I couldn't figure out why, and I thought it must be my lens. I've got a bad lens. I got to throw it away. Got to fix it. Got to do something with my lens. But it wasn't. So today we'll go through the real things you should be checking before you give up on a lens. Now, the first reason, and it should be the obvious reason that your picture is blurry, is the camera just didn't focus on what you thought was your subject. Now, one of the first reasons this might happen is because you have your camera set to try and detect what your subject is and then focus on it for you. Now, this can happen in some of the earlier models where it has a whole screen and says, I'll pick the subject from the whole screen area, or even in some more sophisticated models where it has what's called a zone AF, zone autofocus, or expanded autofocus, where it's more of a box, and anything within that box the camera thinks is the subject, it focuses on that. Now, here's the thing. No matter what the manufacturer tells you, the camera doesn't know what your subject is. You know what your subject is. And that's the problem with the automatic focus selections, right? Because the camera with its fancy algorithms will look for what's most prominent, what's closest. It will even detect people. It will detect what it thinks is the subject. But if what it thinks is the subject isn't what you want to be the subject, you miss the focus because the camera is focusing on something else. So the first reason is you look through the viewfinder and you saw what you thought you locked in and you pressed the shutter, but the camera focused on something different. So your subject is out of focus, but likely if you look at the image, you'll see something else maybe behind your subject or somewhere else is sharply in focus, and you know that you just missed your subject. So the second reason might be if you go with a single point autofocus and you think, I'm going to just choose the one point and I'm going to focus there. But while you're shooting, you get excited and somehow maybe you bump it to another location, or the subject moves and you're still shooting and now it's pointed somewhere else and now something else is in focus, but your subject isn't. So you've got to go back and say, is my single point autofocus where I wanted it to be to get a good image, right? Because again, your subject is out of focus, but you see something else right behind or somewhere else in the frame that's sharply in focus. Again, you know, you just missed by focusing on the wrong thing. It's not the camera's fault this time. It's perhaps something you have done to make that occur. Sometimes with your fancy face detect, eye detect, all the new, fancy autofocus modes that you get on a lot of the mirrorless cameras, sometimes it still misses the mark. I remember I was shooting a wrestling tournament and I was using the eye detect autofocus, but they were moving and their bodies were in the way and it was dark and it was just a mess. And every time I shot with the eye detect autofocus, it just couldn't find the eye quick enough. And sometimes it's just not a good selection. So I had to go back to the single point and then lock in where I saw them moving and where the eye was. And so sometimes your face or eye detection can also just miss the mark due to just a number of reasons. That it's far away, it's dark, they're moving. There are just a lot of reasons why it might miss the mark. No matter what the manufacturer tells you, it's not 100% certain. Although they are very, very accurate, I'll admit. They're very, very accurate, but there are times when it just misses the mark, and now you have an out of focus picture. The other way you can get a blurry picture by choosing the wrong setting is by choosing the wrong what's called autofocus operation in Canon cameras or autofocus modes in others. And an easy way to decide which one to choose is to ask the question, is my subject moving? Because this decision is designed to help you get focus on either something that's moving or something that's at a standstill. And so in your Canon cameras, if your subject is moving, if the answer is yes, my subject is moving, you would go with what's called servo in the new Canon mirrorless cameras, or in the older DSLRs, we'll call it AI servo. In your Nikons and other brands, you'll see AFC for continuous autofocus. And what this means is it's designed to work on a subject that's moving. And say someone's riding a bicycle and they're coming toward you. If you put your autofocus a point right over the subject as they're moving towards you while you're depressing the shutter, it will continue to focus on them. So when you depress the shutter, they will still be in focus. So this is designed to keep continuously autofocus on moving subjects. Now, if you use it on a subject that's standing still, for instance, it could work. But if let's say you try to do what some people do called focus and recompose, you lock in focus and then you move the camera to recompose, it's still will be focusing on whatever it's pointed at that time, because it's continuously focusing. And so now you might get, again, the background in focus, but your subject is out of focus. Now, if your subject is not moving, then you should be choosing what's called one shot in Canon cameras, or AFS in Nikon and other cameras. And basically this is designed for the subject, of course, that's at rest and not moving, that's at a standstill. And so you can depress your shutter, lock in focus on your subject, and you'll see usually in a lot of cameras, you'll hear a beep if that's turned on, or you'll see that autofocus point will change color to tell you it's locked in on your subject. And then you can go ahead and depress the shutter knowing that your subject is in focus. But this works when a subject is at a standstill. Now, if you lock in and that subject moves and continues moving toward you, the camera's locked in for that distance. And so any movement after that's locked in, that can make your subject go out of focus. So you'll have to, again, when the subject stops again, go ahead and grab focus again by, again, depressing the shutter halfway, locking in focus, and then letting the camera know I'm locked in focus for this specific distance. All right. So that's the other setting that could lead to your image being out of focus. You've chosen the wrong AF operation or AF mode on your camera. Another reason you could mess up is you could be in manual focus when you think you're in autofocus. I can't tell you how many times I've done this. By mistake, I bumped a button that put my camera in manual focus and could not figure out why it wasn't focusing on my subject, and my subjects were always blurry. And it's because I'm in manual focus. One of the ways that happens is when I'm trying to go and do a custom white balance. And we'll talk about this in another video if you don't understand what that is. But to get custom white balance and lock in and take a picture of something that's white, I sometimes will put my camera into manual focus just so it'll take the picture, because it's not going to focus on a pure white piece of paper or whatever I'm using as my target. And so when I do that and I go back to shooting, I forget to put it back from manual to regular autofocus mode. And now I'm shooting and my pictures are blurry and I can't figure out why. It's because they're in manual focus. Duh. So now the other reason your picture could be out of focus might have nothing to do with settings. You might have picked all the right settings and still have an image that's blurry. And that's usually caused by camera shake. And so you might know that when anything that moves in front of the camera shows up as a blur, and when I depress my shutter, I move the camera slightly, and that too, if the shutter speed is slow enough, could cause a blur, and that will cause camera shake. Now, you'll recognize camera shake because unlike the other modes, when something else is in focus, you can find something else in the frame that's sharply in focus. When you have camera shake, everything tends to look blurry. You tend to see the blur all the way across the frame, and now you know I better check my shutter speed to see if the camera is using a fast enough shutter speed to avoid camera shake. And a good rule of thumb is whatever the focal length of the lens you're using, this is a 50 millimeter lens, I'll try and use the equivalent of that shutter speed or faster, meaning with this 50 millimeter lens, I'm going to try and shoot 1/50th of a second or faster if I'm going handheld, to try and make sure I avoid camera shake. Now, a lot of the new cameras have the in-body stabilization, and they have stabilization in the lens, so you might be able to get away with slower shutter speeds. But that rule of thumb is a safe place to go if you find yourself coming up with camera shake or your images are turning out blurry. Okay. Now, your camera shake might not be just because your shutter speed is too slow. It could be because you're not holding the camera steady. You're not holding the camera with your hands, really supporting the lens and shooting in a way that reduces the possibility of shake. You might be just holding it with one hand, or some people hold it wrong like that. All these things, not holding the camera steady, can also lead to camera shake, even if you have a fast enough shutter speed in some cases. So also be very aware of that you are supporting the camera if you see you're coming up with a blurry picture. Now, there are other reasons too why you might get a blurry picture. You just might be too close to your subject for the camera to lock in focus. Most lenses have what's called a minimum focusing distance, meaning if you get closer than that, the camera just can't lock in focus. You'll find that in your lenses manual, how close that is, and you just might need to back up a little bit and then try again. And that too will give your camera the opportunity to lock in focus. The other reason your camera might not be focusing properly is your subject just might lack the contrast it needs to lock in. So, your camera usually looks at adjacent pixels and it looks for contrast so it can lock in and decide where to focus. And if you have something like, say, this egg, and you try to focus in the middle of the egg, or something that is just, the same continuous color with no contrast, then that too might make your camera hunt a little bit and you might miss focus. So you'll have to try and find something with some contrast and lock in there, like perhaps the edge of that egg. And hopefully that will give you enough contrast to lock in and get you a picture that's in focus. The other reason you might be missing focus is you're using a very shallow depth of field. And again, the margin for error is so small with these shallow depth of field settings that you might have either misfocused or the focus is just so shallow that it looks like it's blurry. If you're using a 1.2, 1.4 lens and you are just locked in a very shallow focus, it's possible that the eye would be in focus and the ear not be in focus, depending on how close you are to the subject. And so that might be a reason too. And for instance, if the focus moves over to the tip of the nose, the eye might be a little soft because the margin for error with those kind of lenses is just so small. You could think you're out of focus, but it's just your depth of field is just so very shallow. You've got to be very precise. You'll see this a lot when you're shooting in macro photography and you're getting really close and you're shooting in macro. You will find that if you have a wide open aperture, that it's very tough to lock in and focus because such a small area will be in focus. It will look like a lot of your image is just blurry. And so you'll have to then raise your f-stop to a larger number, a smaller opening that gives you a wider depth of field. And so that could be another reason too why you are getting a blurry picture. Now, if you've tried all those things and you are still getting blurry pictures, it could be the lens. But I found that 99% of the time, it's user error when I'm getting blurry pictures. And so here's what you can do. You put your camera on a tripod. You will choose a mid-range f-stop. You will make sure you're not touching the camera when you're taking the photograph, meaning you're using the self-timer or remote control or cable release. You'll take the photograph, and then you'll check to see if it's sharply in focus. Now, if you've done that and now, again, the images are sharply in focus, you know that it's probably user error. And so you've got to go back and decode through all those steps again. Now, why was my original picture out of focus and blurry? I know why. I had camera shake. Even though I had plenty of light, even though my shutter speed was fast enough for that lens, I got camera shake because if you notice, I was shooting at a train track. And so my model was standing on the platform and I wanted to get more distance. So I leaned over the track on the other side, and I held this camera with this big old lens with one hand off to the side, and I tried to shoot like this. It is the most unsteady way of holding this camera. And even though I had everything else going for me, because I wasn't holding the camera and keeping it steady, I got camera shake. And that's how I got the blurry picture. Now, if you're still getting blurry pictures and you're not sure why, you've got to go through those steps. Did the camera focus on the right thing? Did I have the right settings? Was I holding the camera steady? Did I get camera shake? Go through all of those steps, and I'm sure somewhere in there, you'll find your culprit. All right? Here's the sharp pictures. Thank you so much for hanging out. If you like what we're doing, of course, remember, hit the subscribe button, ring the bell. That makes sure that you get these updates whenever they come out. And I'll see you again next Thursday with another video. Until then, go create something amazing with your camera. Take care.